Walk out to your driveway. Look at your car. Look at the tires. They are black. They are round. They are boring. You probably never think about them until one of them goes flat. You buy them, you drive on them, and you forget them. But that black circle is one of the most important inventions in human history. Without rubber, the modern world stops. Planes can't land, cars can't move, trucks can't deliver food, hospitals can't seal their equipment. Rubber is not just a product, it is power. But have you ever asked yourself, where does it come from? It doesn't come from a factory. It comes from a tree that bleeds a white, milky liquid called latex. And to get that liquid, someone has to cut the tree. Someone has to collect the drops. For 90 years, millions of those drops have been collected in a small African country called Liberia. And they were collected by a company that you know very well. A company that sponsors racing cars. A company that claims to be a symbol of American innovation. Firestone. But the story of Firestone in Liberia is not a story of innovation. It is a story of a corporate occupation. It is a story of a company that bought a nation, enslaved its people, and when a genocidal warlord started eating the hearts of his enemies, Firestone didn't run away. They signed a check. This is the true story of blood rubber. This is how an American tire company funded one of the bloodiest civil wars in African history, just to keep the assembly lines moving in Detroit. Chapter 1. The Sale of a Nation. To understand this crime, we have to go back to 1926. The United States was booming. Henry Ford was building cars. But America had a problem. They had the steel, they had the oil, but they didn't have the rubber. The British Empire controlled the rubber trade in Asia, and they were charging high prices. Harvey Firestone, the founder of Firestone Tires, was tired of paying the British. He wanted his own supply. He wanted a private kingdom of rubber. He looked at the map and found Liberia. Liberia is a special country. It was founded by the United States in the 1800s as a place for freed American slaves to return to Africa. Its capital, Monrovia, is named after US President James Monroe. Its flag looks just like the American flag. But by 1926, Liberia was bankrupt. They were desperate for money. So, Harvey Firestone made them an offer they couldn't refuse. He offered to pay off their national debt. In exchange, he demanded land. Not just a small farm. He demanded 1 million acres. That is roughly 10% of the arable land in the entire country. And the price? He paid 6 cents per acre. But the worst part was the timeline. The lease was for 99 years. In the blink of an eye, a foreign corporation became the true owner of the country. The Liberian government signed the deal. They essentially sold their sovereignty to a tire salesman. Firestone built the world's largest rubber plantation. It was a state within a state. They had their own roads, their own police, their own laws. The Liberian government couldn't touch them. But who was going to work on this million-acre farm? Chapter 2. The Quota. Modern Slavery. For the next 60 years, Firestone operated a system that looked a lot like the slavery America had supposedly abolished. Rubber tapping is brutal work. You have to wake up at 4 a.m. while it is still dark, because the latex flows best in the cool morning air. You walk miles into the forest. You use a sharp knife to cut a precise line in the bark of the tree. If you cut too deep, you kill the tree. If you cut too shallow, the rubber doesn't flow. Then you have to carry 2 massive buckets of liquid rubber, weighing 70 pounds, back to the weighing station. Firestone didn't pay the workers an hourly wage. That would be too fair. Instead, they created the daily quota. Every worker had to tap roughly 650 to 700 trees every single day. Think about that number. 700 trees. You have to walk to them, cut them, and collect from them. It is physically impossible for one man to do it alone in a single day. But here was the catch. If you didn't meet the quota, you got paid nothing. Not half pay, 0. If you tapped 600 trees, you went home with empty pockets. Your family starved, so the men had no choice. They had to bring help. They brought their wives, and most tragically, they brought their children. For decades, if you walked into the Firestone plantation, you wouldn't just see men. You would see 8-year-old boys and girls running from tree to tree, carrying heavy buckets of toxic chemicals. They weren't on the payroll. Firestone could claim, "We don't hire children." And technically, they were right. The children were helpers. But the system was designed so that the father could not survive without enslaving his own children. This wasn't just a job, it was a generational trap. You were born on the plantation, you worked on the plantation, and you died on the plantation. But in 1989, the suffering turned into a slaughter. Chapter 3. The Warlord. In 1989, a man named Charles Taylor launched a rebellion to overthrow the Liberian government. Charles Taylor is one of the most evil men of the 20th century. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a monster. He recruited thousands of child soldiers. He gave them drugs, cocaine mixed with gunpowder, to make them fearless and crazy. His army was called the NPFL, National Patriotic Front of Liberia. They didn't just kill people, they butchered them. They had units with names like the Butt Naked Brigade, who fought with no clothes on to terrify their enemies. They chopped off hands. They engaged in cannibalism. Liberia collapsed into hell. When the war started, almost every foreign company packed up and left. The US Peace Corps left. The mining companies left. It was too dangerous. But Firestone stayed. Why? Because rubber trees are not like a gold mine. If you leave a gold mine for 5 years, the gold is still there when you come back. But rubber trees are alive. If you stop maintaining them, the jungle takes over. The trees get diseases. They die. Firestone had billions of dollars invested in those trees. They couldn't leave. But Charles Taylor had conquered the area where the plantation was located. He controlled the roads. He controlled the ports. Firestone had a choice. They could abandon the plantation and lose their investment, or they could make a deal with the devil. Chapter 4: Operation Octopus. In the early 1990s, while the world was watching the news in horror, Firestone executives were holding secret meetings with Charles Taylor. Taylor needed money to buy guns. Firestone needed to export rubber. So they struck a deal. We know this because the documents were later revealed in court. Firestone agreed to pay taxes to Charles Taylor. But you don't pay taxes to a rebel warlord. You pay bribes. You pay funding for a war machine. In 1991 and 1992, Firestone gave Charles Taylor over $2.3 million in cash, checks, and food supplies. That money was the lifeblood of Taylor's army. With Firestone's cash, he bought AK-47s. He bought rocket-propelled grenades. He bought the bullets that killed innocent civilians. But it got worse. Firestone needed security. They needed someone to guard their trees from thieves and hungry refugees. Who did they hire? They used Charles Taylor's rebels. Imagine this. An American company, listed on the stock exchange, was using child soldiers and drug-fueled rebels as their private security guards. Firestone turned their plantation into a supply base for the rebellion. They let Taylor use their trucks. They let him use their warehouses to store weapons. They let him use the plantation as a command center to launch attacks on the capital city, Monrovia. One of the most infamous attacks was called Operation Octopus. Taylor launched a massive assault on the capital, killing thousands. Where was the attack planned? From the safety of the Firestone plantation. The rubber kept flowing out, the money kept flowing in, and the blood kept spilling. Chapter 5: The Massacre at Carter Camp. There is one specific night that haunts the people of Liberia. It happened at a place called Carter Camp, a worker housing unit inside the Firestone plantation. By 1993, the war had turned chaotic. The Liberian government army, the ECOMOG peacekeeping force, was fighting back against Taylor. They started bombing the plantation because they knew Taylor was hiding there. The Firestone managers, the Americans, were safe in their fortified houses or had evacuated to the US. But the workers, the tappers, they were left defenseless in the crossfire. The workers begged Firestone to evacuate them. They said, "It's too dangerous, we are going to die." Firestone refused. They needed the workers to keep tapping the trees. If the workers left, the rubber stopped. Then the massacre happened. In the middle of the night, soldiers, it is disputed whether they were Taylor's men or government forces, but they were there because of the plantation, attacked Carter Camp. They massacred over 600 workers and their families. Men were hacked to death with machetes in their beds. Children were shot. The next day, the bodies were piled up like garbage. If Firestone had shut down the plantation, those people would have been gone. They would have been refugees, but they would have been alive. They died because they were essential assets for a tire company's bottom line. Chapter 6. The Aftermath and the Lawsuit. The war finally ended in 2003. Charles Taylor was eventually arrested and put on trial for war crimes in The Hague. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. But what about his financier? What about Firestone? In 2005, a group of Liberian survivors, with the help of international lawyers, filed a lawsuit in the United States. It was called Flomo v. Firestone. They accused Firestone of using child labour and aiding and abetting a war criminal. The evidence was damning. There were memos. There were receipts showing the payments to Taylor. Firestone's defence was shocking. They didn't deny paying Taylor, they admitted it. But they argued, we had no choice. If we didn't pay him, he would have hurt our workers. We were victims of extortion. They painted themselves as the good guys who were just trying to survive. But the judge and the public asked a simple question. Why didn't you just leave? Other companies left. Why was a tire more important than a genocide? Firestone fought the lawsuit for years. In the end, the US legal system failed the Liberians. The case was dismissed on technical jurisdictional grounds, basically saying US courts couldn't punish a company for things that happened in Liberia. Firestone paid $0 in damages for the war. However, the pressure worked in a different way. CNN and other networks started exposing the child labour. The bad PR was hurting the brand. So Firestone finally agreed to make changes. They built schools. They claimed to stop the quota system, though workers say it still exists in different forms. They mechanized some of the transport. They cleaned up their image. Conclusion. The cost of the drive. Today, Charles Taylor sits in a prison cell in Great Britain. But Firestone is still in Liberia. They signed a new deal in 2005 to keep the land for another 37 years. They still control the future of the country. When you look at the poverty in Liberia today, it is one of the poorest nations on earth. You have to ask, where did the wealth go? The wealth was sucked out of the trees, put on a ship, turned into a tire, and sold in a Walmart in Ohio. The wealth built mansions in America, while it left mass graves in Africa. The story of Firestone is the ultimate example of corporate colonialism. It teaches us that a company doesn't need an army to conquer a country. It just needs a checkbook and a lack of conscience. So, the next time you are driving your car and you feel the smooth grip of the tires on the road, remember where that grip comes from. It comes from the sap of a tree in a broken country. It comes from the sweat of a child who should have been in school. And it comes from a deal made with a warlord in the middle of a genocide. The rubber is black, but the history is red.